We back at it again with another episode of Locked In. Welcome to episode 29. I have another guest for y'all today, Joey McMurry, Director of Broadcasting for the Oregon Sports Network. I'm going to go ahead and let Joey introduce himself to you guys really quickly and tell you about his upbringing and things like that.
Well, hey, thanks. First of all, for having me on. I appreciate it, bro, because it's cool for me to be able to talk with people like yourself that want to get into all this kind of stuff and have fun with it. It is a fun job. I grew up in a lot earlier than most people do. That I love sports, so I wanted to do something else related to sports, and that's what got me into broadcasting. So went to school at Oregon and never left. I've been at Oregon ever since. So it's been a fun ride. Yeah, I do a lot of different broadcast stuff, and it's a good time. I got to tell you.
Most definitely. So just talk about, I read you grew up in Santa Cruz, California. Just talk about what it was like growing up there.
Man, it was an interesting place, to say the least. Santa Cruz is a bubble within a bubble within a bubble within a bubble within a bubble, and then within another bubble. Everybody in Santa Cruz is like very much the same way. It's not a big sports town. Everybody's there either surfing or, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all the sports that there are in Santa Cruz. I grew up surfing and doing all that stuff, but I always loved, the big team sports. So I spent a lot of time driving to San Jose and San Francisco to go watch Giants and A's games, 49ers and Raiders games, Warriors games, Sharks games. That was what I was doing, So I was kind of unique actually in Santa Cruz being the big sports guy. And it wasn't until I got to college that I was like, oh yeah, everybody actually loves team sports this much. Like, this is great. So it was an interesting place. And to be honest, Eugene's kind of similar. They're, regardless of your political views, they're both very politically liberal, and they're both big college towns. That's really the way that both of the cities are built. And
right.
So they're kind of similar, but it's been an interesting life to have lived in both of these places.
So when did you first realize you had a passion for play-by-play broadcasting? When did that come about?
Probably when I was in high school. So I hurt my arm when I was in high school, so I couldn't really do much for a while. And that was when I had that harsh realization, like, damn, I can't just play sports the rest of my life. And so I listened to Mike Krukow, Dwayne Kuiper, Dave Fleming, and Jon Stewart. They were or John Miller, excuse me. I'm now getting into my comedian days. You'll see why I brought up Jon Stewart in a minute. Okay. So I listened to all those four guys doing Giants games all the time, and I just loved the personality that they brought. They aren't guys that take themselves too seriously. I think everyone's guilty of that at times. Like, you just take yourself way too seriously, and you just don't have enough fun with yourself, and you got to have a certain level of professionalism, especially in this business, but you also have to have fun with it. It is sports, for crying out loud, right? So
yeah, most definitely.
Those guys were that way, and that's why I loved them. And so that was when I really, I think, realized, like, man, I could do this if I could do this for a living, that would be the dream. Like, you never work a day in your life if you love your job, that whole adage, right? Well, so with that in mind, I also was just getting old enough to have really taken an interest in politics and in government and in the way that the world works. You kind of start to figure that out when you're in high school.
Right.
That was when I started watching The Daily Show, and that was when I started watching a lot of late night shows. And I kind of thought to myself, like, man, there's got to be a way that these two things can go together. You should be able to crack jokes and have fun and do broadcasts of quote unquote, like, serious sporting events, right? So that was kind of the approach I took. And I always loved, like, Jon Stewart would do bits about sports in New York. Like, he hated on the Knicks all the time. And, like, I just got a huge kick out of that. Like, I thought it was hilarious. And so that was kind of the path that I took. So that was kind of when I realized, like, yeah, this is going to be cool.
So talk about graduating from the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, also being a part of the Magna Cum Laude Academic Social Network program, kind of how that molded you into, what you're doing today, play-by-play broadcasting, and just how that helped you.
Yeah, the SOJC at Oregon is something else. I was lucky enough to to attend Oregon. I started 1 year before the journalism school got renovated. So it was like this huge renovation that they did, adding a bunch to the facility. So my sophomore year was when they opened Allen Hall, and it was just a huge, huge opportunity for everybody that was at the journalism school. And I owe a lot to the journalism school, particularly my professor, Rebecca Force. She was a longtime broadcast journalist. She worked for a number of different TV stations in her career as an anchor, as an executive producer, as a news director. And, you know, I really learned like what makes a good story and how do you visually tell that story from her. And then the other side of that coin is as you said, I took my studies pretty seriously. You know, I graduated in 3 years, actually. I was the guy that was like, I don't want to pay tuition anymore. I want to get paid to work. And so I took that approach, you know, of like, if I have to take 22 credits a term, like I'm going to do it because that was just how I was. Like I wanted to get into the industry, you know, and that was what motivated me. But really I owe a lot to the student radio station, KWVA at Oregon. Outstanding organization. You know, that it's kind of interesting at Oregon, like the student radio station isn't part of the journalism school. So it's like its own independent thing. But I owe a lot to KWVA. Like that was where I got all the repetition, and I listened to myself and was like, wow, some of that really sucked. Like I need to get better when I'm doing play-by-play, right? Like, so that was a big part of it too. But you know, there aren't a lot of people in my family that have graduated from college, and so I'm still pretty proud of that. Like, I think that in today's day and age, it's not as celebrated as it was even like 20 years ago. You know, like you still see a lot of people that are first generation college graduates, and I think that is. I mean, I wish that we still celebrated that more. Like, I think it's a huge deal, and that's a huge accomplishment.
Most definitely. I'm glad that you say that because I feel like in today's generation, you know, people sometimes think they don't need like a college degree to, you know, they say you don't need to be successful, but it really helps in like a big, big way. And me personally, I didn't understand that until I was out of high school. When I first got into college, the importance of having a degree and just how it looks on your resume and certain things like that. So it's a very important for all the listeners out there that's watching. It's very important to, you know, try and get a college degree. It's not, I'm not saying that it's for everyone, but most definitely.
I agree. I mean, and let me turn that back to you then. It's also, I don't think it's just like the degree and having it for your resume. I think it's also just the experience, you know, of growing up. You know, I think it's a huge accomplishment if you can say that.
Most definitely. So, June 2014, talk about how you felt being named the host and being handed the torch of Duck Insider play-by-play broadcasting.
Yeah, it was, you know, I've often said that a lot of times in this industry, you have to kind of make your own luck, you know, and what I mean by that is like, you better be really prepared so that when someone has a job opportunity, they're going to call you and no one else. Like, that's what I always mean by make your own luck. And so at that point, I felt like I did. Like, well, one, I was the cheap option. Like, let's be honest. I was the college graduate who needed a job. But that was what happened, right? Is I was the guy that was around. The folks that were in charge of the Oregon Sports Network and at the university were like, well, he's here. We like him. Let's hire him, you know? And so I was, to be honest, because there's not very many people that are broadcasters for universities around the country, and there really aren't very many that are broadcasters for Oregon. And so it meant a lot to me. Jerry Allen, I owe a lot to him. He's been the voice of the Ducks for 34 years now. And I don't know what the hell he saw in me, but he looked at me and he said, yeah, this guy could be something. And that was why I got the job, which, you know, I still don't know what he saw, but that's why I'm here. And so, yeah, it was a big deal.
Most definitely. So now let's jump to August 23rd, 2017. Talk about the transition of going from play-by-play baseball to being named the voice of the men's basketball program for Oregon. Talk about that.
That was huge. You know, that was like, there's a lot of people that are in a position similar to the position I was in, right? Where it's like, okay, you're you're doing like some show hosting, you're doing baseball. Like baseball is a sport where there's so many teams out there, there's so many opportunities that you can do it. And so that was big for me in that it was kind of the next step, right? Like basketball is that next step up from baseball. And when Jerry decided to step down from basketball, he's still doing football. When he decided to step down from basketball, you know, they kind of were like, it just makes sense, you know. And the people empowered Oregon saying that to me just meant a whole lot, because it, you know, it was sort of like the confirmation of, okay, this is why you do all the hard work, right? And like,
Right.
and to be honest, like this is why you build those sorts of relationships. And it's like, yeah, you know, this is something that's important, and having those relationships is really important. So yeah, it meant a lot, man. It was a big deal, and also because basketball is such a different sport to call than baseball. Like baseball is a sport that I always joke is kind of like made for the radio, because there's time for you to tell stories and like, you know, like could you imagine if Vin Scully was around in the era of podcasts? Like his podcast would have killed, because he would have had all this time and energy from his baseball days, and he had so much practice telling all these long stories. Basketball is the complete opposite of that. In basketball, like I don't tell any stories, you know, like I barely have enough time to say who has the ball sometimes.
Right.
Like it's such a fast game. So professionally, I was super excited for that opportunity, because it's a total different end of the spectrum, you know, like it's just a total different art in how you go about calling basketball compared to baseball.
Most definitely. I would definitely say it's a huge transition, because baseball is a much more slower game than basketball, for sure. You know, basketball, people were pushing the fast break. Baseball, you have innings and certain things like that. So kudos to you for being able to transition from baseball to basketball, because I'm pretty sure that was a huge thing you had to learn, a big step,
Thanks.
most definitely. So I just have to ask you this. Now that you have all the experience, you know, you've done certain play-by-play for baseball, basketball, talk about the different roles and responsibilities that you've had over the years with play-by-play broadcasting. You know, I know it's a lot of them, so you don't have to name it a whole bunch of them, but you could just name like the basics.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny, like the longer that I've been in this position, the more time I spend on coordination and like management than I do the actual broadcast stuff, you know, like the actual research that goes into putting on the broadcast. Like I spend less time on that now than I did probably 3 years ago. And I think that's just kind of the nature of, you move up, for lack of a better phrase, you move up the food chain, you know, and you end up with more to do. But really, to the direct answer to your question with the responsibilities of play-by-play is, it all starts with, you got to know the rosters. You know, you got to know everything there is to know about everybody that you might see in the game, because that's how you sound good. You know, like you don't want to be flipping through your note cards when something big happens and you want to be able to talk about it. You know, so you got to know it like the back of your hand. That's your first responsibility. The second responsibility, and this isn't true of every broadcaster, but it's true of a lot of us, is you got to be engineering your own broadcast. So you're running the mixer, you're getting all the different microphones and the feeds coming into the mixer, and then you got to make it sound good. You know, it's not just does your voice sound good, and you know, can you say everything correctly? It's, well, you better not have your mic turned up so loud that we've all heard this, that when you make a big call, it crackles and then no one can hear what the hell you're saying. So that's honestly a huge responsibility. And then I think in kind of summation, it's also just building a rapport. For someone like me, it's building a rapport with your head coach and the assistant coaches, because, you know, I work for the team, right? Like my job is to connect the team to the fan base. So the most effective way to do that is have a relationship with the coaches and the players. So I honestly, that takes time. I mean, and that takes work, you know, like getting to know people like that, you know, it doesn't just happen. So, and then there's a lot of other boring stuff that goes on that we don't need to get into, because everyone will be like, well, then I really don't want to get into this industry. But, you know, but the one other thing that I would say is, like, doing a daily show, you know, like a talk show like Duck Insider, you know, that's kind of a different animal. You know, the majority of that is just making sure that I know what to ask every person who comes on the show. Like today we had our women's golf coach on the show, and women's golf doesn't have the same following that football and basketball do. But talking to him, because almost his entire roster is from overseas, well, you can imagine in a pandemic, what does that look like? I mean, how do you do that? They have a student athlete who was still in Taiwan, took her entire fall term of classes while still in Taiwan, and was getting up in the middle of the night in order to take her classes because of, the time difference.
Right.
I think stories like that are ridiculously cool. But the only reason that I even knew to ask about that was looking at the roster and thinking, oh, well, look at this. This is interesting,
I'm glad that you actually spoke on the pandemic a little bit. Talk about COVID and if that affected you in any type of way.
Oh, it did. It did. In March, when everything started, this is a true story. So when we got word of how serious COVID was, it was the night after the NBA had shut down. Okay. So NBA shuts down. Me, the entire Oregon basketball team are in Las Vegas getting ready for the Pac-12 tournament. So the first day of the Pac-12 tournament, Oregon wasn't playing because Oregon had a bye in the first round. So we're watching the games, and then we get word the NBA is shutting down, and we're all sitting. And this is how weird this is, right? To think about now. Like, I'm sitting in a casino in Las Vegas eating dinner, and I get an alert on my phone saying NBA shut down. Well, I'm sitting there watching the Pac-12 tournament that's happening across the street, and it's like, whoa. Next morning, I am in the team's meeting room. They had just watched film getting ready for Oregon State, who the Ducks were going to play like 3 hours later. This is true. Coach Altman brings everybody together, and he says, all right, fellas, we know that this is going to be different because at this point, there weren't going to be fans, but the games were still going to be played.
Right.
All right, fellas, we know that things are going to be a little different. We got to bring our own energy. He says the things you'd expect a head coach to say, motivating his team in that situation. This is like straight out of a movie. Our director of operations opens the door. He's on his phone, and he goes, yeah, we're canceled. Coach had just gathered the team for the post scouting report huddle and, go Ducks. And then he just goes, all right, fellas, well, I guess head back to your rooms and we'll let you know what we're going to do. And I'm sitting there because right after they do scouting report, normally that's when I talk to Coach Altman for our pregame interview that we do before every game. So I'm just sitting there stunned. I don't know what to do. So I have to call all of our radio affiliates, our 27 affiliates across the state of Oregon that carry the basketball games, not to mention all of our online radio, TuneIn and all those clients, or not clients, all those providers, and say, hey, we don't have a broadcast. Sorry, I know it's 2.5 hours notice, but we don't have a broadcast for you. There's no game. So that was the beginning of it. Then it became, okay, if we don't have any spring sporting events, we don't have any baseball games to broadcast, do we still do the daily show? It's kind of hard to do a show inside Duck Athletics when there's no Duck Athletics going on.
Right.
So we decided in that moment, all right, we're going to kind of wrap up the year and then we're not going to do the show anymore. Well, as a result of that, I went down to working just 1 day a week for about 2 months, just because we didn't have any events. We didn't have anything to talk about. We didn't have anything to broadcast. So it did affect me, and so that was the first time I had more than a couple days in a row off in years. In this industry, there's always something going on the weekends and everything else. So that was a long-winded answer to your question, but it did affect me. And then, we brought the show back in August when we thought we were going to have football. Then that got pushed back or canceled.
Yeah,
that got pushed back. It was wild. Figuring out what to talk about when there's no events was a challenge, but it was also pretty rewarding when all was said and done, because we were able to have some longer form interviews, in a more really the show is formatted as a radio TV show that fits into an hour window every day. Right. Well, the nice thing with podcasts is you could do a 20-minute interview. You could do a 2-hour interview. That's the beauty of it. Well, we kind of took it to that. Like we started doing these long form interviews that we would record, and we would do like 30-40 minute interviews with people, just telling their story and sometimes talking about things that have nothing to do with Oregon athletics, but the connection was that the individual I'm interviewing happened to be a Duck. Well, we would then produce them and make it fit into the hour-long show. We had never really considered doing stuff like that before because there was always a sporting event to talk about, right?
Right.
So in some ways, I actually think that the show is better off now than it was a year ago because we now all recognize like, well, we can do that kind of stuff and it's cool, like people want to hear the in-depth stories and, we've been able to do that. So long story short, it's definitely been different.
Right.
And doing broadcasts without fans.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's very weird.
Not fun. The running joke is normally my broadcast location is at the scorer's table, like courtside, right next to the men's basketball bench, right? So I mean, like I could spit on Coach Altman, and that's a terrible thing to say with everything that's going on in the world right now.
Right.
But like you know what I'm saying, right?
I know what you're saying. That's how close you were.
Yeah. So, and there's been times where Coach Altman accidentally picks up my water bottle off the counter instead of his that's sitting, 5 feet away. And so, it's something like, but he's never been able to hear like a word I'm saying because it's so loud in there, right?
Pretty sure.
Like he's sitting as if we're across the table from each other and he can't hear me, right? Unless he has a headset on like I do. Well, now I'm doing games from the top of our first section at the arena. So like on the concourse, I mean, I'm 30-40 rows up. He probably can hear every word I'm saying as I broadcast the games now. And it's weird. It is super weird.
Yeah, most definitely. So the last thing I'm going to ask you for this interview is, what do you want your legacy to be remembered as when it's all said and done? Who does Joey Mac McMurray want to be remembered as?
That's a big question. I mean, I'd like to think I'll have a better answer for that as I get older, but my maybe bad answer right now would just be, I think I want people to remember me as somebody that always got the job done, but also always did it in a fun way. Like I am certainly the first to admit that I can be hard to work with because I have really high expectations for myself and for other people. And I don't keep any secrets. Like I'm the guy that in our meetings, like I don't pull punches, like there's no secrets with me. Like, what I'm thinking. Yeah. But I've also always been afraid that then people are going to remember me as kind of a jerk. You know what I mean? And so I'd like to think that everybody would remember me and my legacy would be, always got the job done, but had fun doing it and had some personality on the broadcast, but I also think that it's important to think about, like, at least I think about this a lot. Like, I don't want people necessarily to be thinking about me when I'm doing the games. I want them to be thinking about the guys that are on the floor,
right.
And the guys that are on the field, that's what this is all about. And so, I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. I wasn't ready for that one. I had to think about it. That's a good question, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I think I'd like people to remember me as like someone that always got the job done and had some fun doing it.
Most definitely. Man, I just want to say I appreciate you coming on the podcast and just talking about your career. Also want to appreciate you for being a mentor to me. Just giving me certain advice and tips on the career I'm trying to pursue and podcasting and having my own talk show. And I just wish you the best of success, man. We're definitely gonna, talk almost every day soon, things like that, keep in contact. But I just keep going. You definitely seem like you found something you have a passion for and a love for. Like they say, you want to find what you love. You want to have a job that you love to do, not that you hate. So just kudos to you for that. And that's it for episode 29 of Locked In, y'all. Make sure you guys keep up with Joey Mac McMurray, broadcasting for the Oregon Sports Network. And y'all tune in for next week's episode. But before we end today's episode, this episode was sponsored by Off the Hustle, where you can be a hustler without ambition. Go get all your merch, clothes at odhapparel.com, and tune in for next week's episode.